The rope that held. The frayed hemp line coiled at Desmond Doss's feet like a sleeping snake, its fibers darkened with mud and something else he didn't want to name. Below him, 70 feet down the sheer face of Hacksaw Ridge, voices called through the pre-dawn darkness, stretcher-bearers and medics catching another wounded soldier he'd lowered into their waiting arms. Above him, across the blood-soaked plateau of Okinawa's most brutal cliff, more voices drifted through the smoke and silence. "Medic over here! Don't leave us! Please, somebody help!" 3 hours had passed since the 77th Infantry Division's assault had collapsed in chaos. The ridge's coral limestone face rose like a wall from the Okinawan countryside, its top a maze of caves and spider holes where Japanese machine gunners had waited with devastating patience. When mortars began raining down and officers screamed retreat orders, most of the American force had scrambled back toward the cliff's edge in panic, rappelling down improvised rope ladders to safety. But in the confusion and terror, wounded soldiers had been left behind. Doss pulled the rope back up hand over hand, feeling each strand's integrity with fingers that had grown sensitive to the hemp's condition. 5 men down. How many more scattered across that plateau? His shoulders ached, his palms were raw and bleeding, but somewhere in the darkness behind him, another voice called for help. The other medics had followed orders, retreating with the main force when the position became untenable. Standard protocol demanded immediate evacuation when defensive lines collapsed. But Doss, the skinny Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia, who'd endured months of ridicule for refusing to carry a weapon, had hesitated at the cliff's edge. Through the smoke and explosions, he could hear wounded Americans crying out across the devastated landscape. Every instinct had screamed at him to follow the rope ladders down to safety. Instead, he'd turned back into hell. Private Johnson from Ohio had been the first, a kid with a bullet through his shoulder and shrapnel embedded in his leg. Johnson's eyes had been wide with shock when Doss appeared through the smoke. "You came back," he'd whispered, voice barely audible over distant machine gun fire. Doss had wrapped field dressings around the wounds with practiced efficiency, his fingers steady despite fear coursing through him like electricity. Getting Johnson to the cliff's edge had required dragging him 30 yards across open ground, every step exposed to enemy fire. The rope, that precious improvised lifeline, had been Doss's desperate solution. Using his belt and strips torn from his uniform, he'd fashioned a harness around Johnson's chest and lowered him down the cliff face, praying with each foot of descent that the hemp wouldn't snap. The rope had held. Johnson had reached safety, but there had been others. Now Sergeant Rodriguez lay unconscious in an aid station below, bandages wrapped around his skull where shrapnel had opened his scalp. Corporal Mitchell was missing 2 fingers, but would live. Private Coleman's shattered thigh bone would heal, given time and proper care. Each descent had tested the rope further, each rescue had pushed Doss closer to the edge of his own endurance. Down below, word was spreading. The unarmed medic had come back. He was getting men down. Hope flickered in the darkness, like candle flames in a storm. "How many more times you figure that rope will hold?" The voice belonged to Sergeant Howell, a grizzled veteran who'd appeared at the cliff's edge despite orders to maintain position below. Howell had been among those who'd initially questioned Doss's refusal to carry a rifle, muttering about dead weight and liability during training back in the States. Now he crouched beside Doss, examining the fraying hemp with professional concern. "Lord willing, as many times as needed," Doss replied, testing another knot with trembling fingers. Howell studied him in the dim light filtering up from below. "You know they're talking about court-martial if you don't come down soon. Captain's orders were clear. Full withdrawal. Men are still calling for help up there. Men are calling for help in a dozen places tonight. Can't save them all." Doss looked up at the plateau, where muzzle flashes occasionally lit the landscape like lightning. "Can try for one more." The rope felt different now, thinner, more fragile. Several strands had parted under Coleman's weight, and the remaining hemp seemed to whisper warnings with each test. But in the distance, barely audible over the wind, another voice called out from the darkness. "Just one more," Doss whispered to himself, coiling the rope carefully. It was a phrase that would echo in his mind for decades to come, though he couldn't know that yet. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The sixth wounded soldier lay behind a shattered tree stump 40 yards from the cliff's edge, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. Private Walsh had been a machine gunner during the initial assault, and pink foam flecked his lips where a bullet had found his chest. When Doss reached him through the maze of shell craters and debris, Walsh grabbed his wrist with desperate strength. "Why?" Walsh whispered. "Why'd you come back?" Doss worked quickly, applying pressure bandages and injecting morphine from his dwindling supply. The coral limestone of Hacksaw Ridge had turned every impact into deadly splinters, and Walsh's wounds were complicated by fragments of stone embedded in his chest and arm. "Couldn't leave you boys behind," Doss said simply, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Lord wouldn't want that." "My..." The journey back to the cliff took 20 minutes of careful movement, with Doss stopping every few yards to check Walsh's breathing and adjust the improvised stretcher he'd constructed from rifle stocks and torn canvas. Okinawa's spring rain had turned the plateau's red soil into treacherous mud, making each step uncertain. In the distance, Japanese positions remained ominously quiet, perhaps believing all Americans had withdrawn, or perhaps waiting for something. When they reached the cliff's edge, Doss examined his rope one final time. The hemp felt like string in places, and he could see individual strands beginning to fray. Below, flashlights moved in organized patterns as the rescue team expanded. Word of his actions had spread beyond the immediate unit, drawing medics and stretcher-bearers from other positions along the Okinawan front. Captain Morrison's voice drifted up from below, carried on the night wind. "Doss, that's a direct order. Get down here now." Doss looked down at Walsh, whose eyes had begun to flutter closed from the morphine. The machine gunner was heavy, nearly 200 pounds of dead weight that would test the rope beyond any previous rescue, but leaving him meant certain death. The Japanese had a habit of finishing wounded Americans when they reclaimed contested ground. "One more time," Doss murmured to the rope, fashioning the harness around Walsh's torso with extra care. He'd learned to reinforce the weak points, spreading the load across multiple knots and using his own body as a counterweight when necessary. The descent began smoothly enough. Walsh's bulk strained the rope immediately, but the hemp held through the first 20 feet. Halfway down, disaster struck. A section of rope parted with a sound like a rifle shot, and Walsh dropped 3 feet before the remaining strands caught his weight. Doss threw himself against the cliff face, wrapping the rope around his waist and letting it burn through his uniform to his skin as he braked the fall. Pain shot through his back and arms as Walsh's weight threatened to drag them both over the edge. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Doss hung suspended between the plateau above and the void below, his boots scrambling for purchase on the wet limestone. Then hands reached up from below. Sergeant Howell and 2 other soldiers had climbed partway up the cliff to help guide Walsh's final descent. When Walsh finally touched solid ground, Doss collapsed against the cliff face, his entire body shaking from strain and adrenaline. Below him, medics surrounded the wounded machine gunner, checking vitals and preparing him for transport to the rear aid station. Above him, the plateau had fallen into an eerie silence that somehow felt more threatening than the earlier gunfire. "That's it, Doss," Captain Morrison called up. "Rope's finished. You're finished. Get down here before I have you arrested for disobeying orders." But as Doss pulled up what remained of his lifeline, now barely 50 feet of questionable hemp, another voice drifted across the plateau. Weaker than the others, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakably calling for help. He looked down at the rope in his hands, then back toward the darkness beyond the ridge. The smart thing, the safe thing, the legal thing was to rappel down and rejoin his unit. 6 men lived because of his actions tonight. 6 families would receive letters beginning with, "We are pleased to inform you," instead of, "We regret to inform you." By any reasonable standard, he'd done enough. But reason had little to do with the voice calling from the darkness, or the conviction that had driven him back up the ridge 6 times already. "Lord," he whispered, testing the remaining rope's strength one more time. "Let it hold for just one more." In the growing darkness above Hacksaw Ridge, Japanese positions stirred with new movement. Night was when they preferred to fight, emerging from caves and spider holes to reclaim ground lost during American daylight assaults. Time was running short, for the wounded man calling out there and for Doss himself. But somewhere in that maze of coral and mud, another American soldier lay bleeding and alone, counting his heartbeats and listening for footsteps that might be rescue or might be death. For Desmond Doss, that made the choice simple, even if everything else about it was impossibly dangerous. He coiled the remaining rope carefully, checking each knot one more time. In a few hours, this night would become part of his official record, compressed into clean military language about conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. But for now, it was just a terrified young man with a fraying rope and an unshakable conviction that he couldn't leave anyone behind. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Gorman, a platoon leader from Baton Rouge who'd taken shrapnel in both legs during the morning assault. Doss found him wedged behind a fallen log, conscious but losing blood from wounds that had soaked through his field dressings hours ago. Gorman's eyes widened when Doss emerged from the smoke and shadows like a ghost. "Jesus, Doss. They said you were still up here, but I didn't believe it." Gorman's voice was weak but alert. "How many times you been down that cliff?" "6, Doss replied, kneeling to examine the lieutenant's wounds. The shrapnel had torn through muscle and nicked arteries, but nothing looked immediately fatal if he could get Gorman to proper medical care soon. "Maybe 7. Depending on how you count. Orders came down 2 hours ago. Full withdrawal to secondary positions. Captain Morrison's been calling for you on the radio." Gorman winced as Doss applied fresh bandages. "Said something about court-martial if you don't report immediately." Doss worked in silence, his practiced hands cleaning and dressing wounds by feel as much as sight. The spring rains that swept across Okinawa had turned into a steady drizzle, making everything slippery and adding to the misery of wounded men who'd been lying exposed for hours. In the distance, he could hear the characteristic sound of Japanese voices, low conversations in a language he didn't understand, but tone he recognized as tactical planning. "Why'd you come back, Doss? Really?" Gorman asked as they began the slow journey toward the cliff edge. 6 men, 7 men. Hell, you could save a dozen, and there'd still be more calling out tomorrow night. It was a question Doss had been asking himself with each trip up and down that rope. The rational answer was simple. He was a medic, sworn to preserve life wherever he found it, but the real answer felt more complicated, tied to something deeper than military oaths or medical training. "Back home in Virginia, my daddy used to take me hunting," Doss said, pausing to shift Gorman's weight on the improvised stretcher. "Never could bring myself to fire at anything living. Used to make him angry, all those wasted shells and empty game bags. But I kept thinking, once you pull that trigger, you can't take it back. Once something's dead, it's dead forever." They'd reached the cliff's edge, where the remaining rope lay coiled like a question mark against the coral limestone. Below, the rescue operation had grown into something resembling organized chaos. Flashlights moved in patterns around a makeshift aid station, and Doss could hear the voices of doctors and nurses who'd been called forward from rear positions. "Same thing here," he continued, testing the rope's remaining strength. "Once I leave someone behind, I can't take that back either. They die up here while I'm safe down there. That's on me forever." Gorman studied him in the dim light. "You know they're saying you're going to get a medal for this, maybe the Congressional Medal of Honor." The suggestion made Doss uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. "Just doing my job." "No, son. Your job was to follow that retreat order 3 hours ago. This is something else." The rope felt impossibly thin now, worn down to perhaps 40 feet of questionable hemp. Several sections showed obvious weakness where individual strands had parted under previous loads. But Gorman was lighter than the others had been, weakened by blood loss, and smaller in build than men like Coleman and Walsh. As Doss fashioned the harness around the lieutenant's chest, Gorman grabbed his arm. "There's something you should know. Radio chatter from other positions. We're not the only unit that took heavy casualties today. Ridge positions all along the Okinawan line got hit hard. Command's talking about pulling back to regroup, maybe for weeks. Meaning this ridge might be abandoned tomorrow. Any wounded left up here." Gorman's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Japanese forces would reclaim the plateau, and any Americans still alive would become prisoners at best. Doss nodded grimly. He'd suspected as much from the radio traffic he'd overheard and the way officers had been talking in tense, clipped sentences. The assault on Hacksaw Ridge had cost far more than anyone had anticipated, and the 77th Infantry Division couldn't sustain such losses indefinitely. The descent with Lieutenant Gorman went smoothly until the final 20 feet, when the rope's weakest section finally gave way. Doss felt the hemp part in his hands like a living thing dying, and for a terrifying moment, Gorman fell free through the darkness. Then hands reached up from below, soldiers who'd positioned themselves to catch anyone whose descent went wrong. When Doss pulled up what remained of his lifeline, he was left with perhaps 20 feet of badly frayed rope. Not enough to reach the bottom, not enough to guarantee anyone's safety, barely enough to lower someone partway down before they'd have to drop or jump the rest. But across the plateau, barely audible over the wind and rain, he could still hear voices calling for help. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The 8th man wasn't calling for help at all. Doss found him in a shell crater near the far edge of the plateau, unconscious and barely breathing, blood seeping from a head wound that had left him silent and still. Private Martinez from El Paso had been part of a forward observation team, carrying a radio when Japanese mortars had zeroed in on American positions just after dawn. Doss knelt beside him in the muddy crater, checking pulse and pupil response by the faint light of distant flares. Martinez's breathing was shallow and irregular, classic signs of serious head trauma. Without immediate medical care, he'd be dead within hours. But getting him to the cliff's edge would require carrying dead weight across 40 yards of open ground, and the remaining rope was barely adequate for lowering a child, let alone a full-grown soldier. Above him, the rim of the shell crater showed fresh scars from recent mortar impacts. The Japanese had been walking their fire across the plateau systematically, searching for any Americans who might still be alive in the wreckage. Sooner or later, they'd send ground troops to finish what the artillery had started. "One more," Doss whispered to himself, the phrase that had become both prayer and promise. "Just one more, Lord." But as he prepared to lift Martinez from the crater, voices drifted across the plateau. Japanese voices, closer than before. Flashlight beams swept through the darkness, accompanied by the soft scrape of boots on coral limestone. A patrol, methodically checking positions the Americans had abandoned. Doss froze, pulling Martinez deeper into the shell crater's shadows. The unconscious soldier's breathing seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence, each exhale a potential death sentence if the enemy patrol heard them. For 10 minutes, that felt like hours. Japanese soldiers moved through the area, their voices growing closer and then gradually fading as they continued their sweep. When silence returned, Doss faced an impossible choice. The remaining rope couldn't safely lower Martinez to the bottom, but it might get him partway down, close enough for the soldiers below to catch him or cushion his fall. It was a desperate gamble that could easily kill the wounded man, but leaving him meant certain death when Japanese forces reclaimed the plateau at dawn. The journey back to the cliff's edge took 25 minutes of careful movement, with Doss stopping frequently to check for enemy patrols and adjust Martinez's position on the improvised stretcher. Okinawa's coral limestone had turned treacherous in the rain, and several times he nearly lost his footing on the slippery surface. At the cliff's edge, Captain Morrison's voice carried up from below. "Doss, I can see you up there. This is your final warning. Get down here immediately or face court-martial for disobeying direct orders." Doss looked down at the scene below. The aid station had expanded into a small field hospital, with doctors working by lantern light under canvas shelters. 7 wounded soldiers lay on stretchers in various stages of treatment. 7 men who'd been left for dead until an unarmed medic refused to abandon them. But Martinez made 8, and the rope in Doss's hands felt more like string than lifeline. "Sorry, Captain," he called down softly, though he doubted Morrison could hear him. "One more to go." Fashioning a harness around Martinez's unconscious form required extra care. The private's head injury made positioning critical. Any jarring or sudden movement could turn a survivable wound into a fatal one. Doss used the last of his medical tape to secure makeshift padding around Martinez's skull, then triple-checked every knot in the harness. The descent began well enough. Martinez's lighter weight put less strain on the deteriorated rope, and for the first 15 feet, Doss allowed himself to hope the hemp might hold. Then, with Martinez still 20 feet above the ground, the rope parted completely. The unconscious soldier fell through the darkness like a stone, but Sergeant Howell and 3 other men had positioned themselves below with a stretched canvas shelter, turning potential disaster into controlled impact. Martinez hit the canvas hard, bouncing once before settling, but the fall had been broken enough to prevent additional injury. Doss found himself alone on the cliff's edge with no rope, no way down, except the same 70-foot drop that would have killed Martinez without intervention. Below, soldiers shouted up at him, offering suggestions and encouragement, but the reality was simple. He was trapped on Hacksaw Ridge, with Japanese patrols closing in, and dawn only hours away. "Doss!" Captain Morrison's voice carried clearly in the night air. "We're sending up new rope. Hold your position." But as Doss waited for rescue, another sound drifted across the plateau, a voice calling for help from the darkness beyond. 9th voice, 9th wounded soldier, 9th impossible choice between safety and responsibility. He looked back toward the sound, then down at the bustling aid station below. 8 men would live because he'd refused to follow retreat orders. 8 families would receive good news instead of telegrams of regret. By any measure, he'd accomplished something extraordinary. Yet somewhere in that darkness, a 9th voice called out through the Okinawan night. The 9th voice belonged to someone Doss would never find. For 20 minutes he searched the far edge of the plateau, moving through shell craters and around demolished positions, following the sound of someone calling "medic" through the darkness. But each time he seemed to get closer, the voice would shift direction, carried on the wind, like an echo of all the wounded men he couldn't save. Eventually, crouched behind a shattered palm tree as Japanese patrols swept closer, Doss realized the truth his mind had been trying to protect him from. The voice wasn't real. Exhaustion, stress, and the accumulated weight of 8 life-or-death rescues had pushed him past the breaking point into auditory hallucinations. His brain manufacturing emergencies his conscience couldn't ignore. The realization hit him like cold water. He was hearing voices that weren't there, chasing wounded men who existed only in his overtaxed mind. For the first time since climbing back up the ridge 6 hours ago, Desmond Doss felt genuinely afraid, not of enemy fire or falling ropes, but of what this night had done to him inside. He knelt in the mud behind the broken tree, hands shaking as the implications sank in. How many real voices had he missed while chasing phantom calls for help? How many actual wounded soldiers lay dying in positions he hadn't checked because his damaged mind was sending him toward imaginary emergencies? "Lord," he whispered, the prayer coming out broken and desperate. "I can't tell what's real anymore. Help me know when to stop." The answer came in the form of new ropes sliding over the cliff's edge, followed by Sergeant Howell's voice. "Doss, where are you? We're coming up." 3 soldiers rappelled down to his position. Howell, a medic named Patterson, and Private Chen, a scout with experience in night movement. They found Doss still kneeling behind the palm tree, staring into darkness that seemed to whisper with voices only he could hear. "How many more up here?" Howell asked, scanning the plateau with practiced eyes. "I thought I heard—" Doss began, then stopped. How could he explain that he'd been chasing hallucinations while real wounded might be dying elsewhere? "I'm not sure. Head's not working right anymore." Patterson, the medic, immediately understood. He'd seen combat exhaustion before, the point where a man's mind simply couldn't process any more trauma without breaking down. "When did you last eat? Sleep? Drink water?" Doss tried to remember and couldn't. The night had become a blur of rope and blood and desperate prayers, with no space for basic human needs. His canteen was empty, his rations forgotten, his body running on pure determination and adrenaline that was finally giving out. "We're going to do one more sweep," Howell decided. "All together, systematic search pattern. Find anyone who's actually up here, then we all go down together." The sweep took 40 minutes and revealed the harsh truth. The plateau was empty of living Americans. Enemy artillery had been brutally effective, and anyone who'd survived the initial barrage had either made it down the cliff or died of wounds in the hours since. Doss had found everyone who could be found, saved everyone who could be saved. But as they prepared to rappel back down, Doss made a discovery that would haunt him for decades. In a shell crater near where he'd been chasing the 9th voice, he found fragments of American equipment, pieces of a radio, torn uniform cloth, scattered medical supplies. Someone had been there recently, wounded and calling for help, but had moved or been moved while Doss searched elsewhere. "Could be from this morning's fighting," Patterson suggested, examining the debris. "This stuff's been here for hours." But Doss knew better. The blood on the torn cloth was too fresh, the arrangement of debris too recent. While he'd been chasing phantom voices created by his exhausted mind, a real wounded soldier had crawled through this area, maybe seeking better cover, maybe trying to reach the cliff's edge, maybe dying alone while the man sworn to help him searched in the wrong direction. The descent to safety passed in silence. 4 men rappelling down the cliff face in the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind a plateau that had become a graveyard of missed chances and impossible choices. Below, the aid station buzzed with organized activity as 8 rescued soldiers received treatment that would save their lives. 8 saves, 1 loss. In the arithmetic of war, those were extraordinary numbers. A night's work that would earn medals and citations, newspaper articles and grateful letters from families who'd been expecting telegrams of regret instead. But Doss would remember the 9th voice for the rest of his life. Real or imagined, it represented every limit of human endurance, every moment when even the strongest conviction wasn't enough, every wounded soldier whose rescue remained just beyond reach of fraying rope and failing strength. Years later, when reporters asked about Hacksaw Ridge, he would speak carefully about approximately how many men he'd rescued, never claiming exact numbers because he knew the true count included voices he'd heard but couldn't find, soldiers he'd searched for but couldn't save, and at least one man whose blood on torn cloth proved that courage and faith, however strong, sometimes weren't enough. The secret he never shared publicly was simpler and more terrible than any official citation. Even heroes have limits, and reaching yours doesn't make you less heroic. It just makes you human. 23 years later, Desmond Doss woke to the sound of rain on his roof in Rising Fawn, Georgia, and for a moment he was back on Hacksaw Ridge with fraying rope in his hands and voices calling from the darkness. The nightmares had faded over the decades, but certain sounds could still transport him instantly. Rain on metal, rope under strain, distant voices calling for help. He sat up in bed, listening to the storm outside, and flexing hands that still bore scars from that night in 1945. The Congressional Medal of Honor sat in a frame downstairs, surrounded by other commendations and letters from the 8 men whose families had written to thank him over the years. But the frame couldn't hold the weight of what those rescues had actually felt like, or the cost of carrying such memories for a lifetime. The official after-action report had compressed that night into 3 clean sentences. Private First Class Doss, disregarding direct orders to withdraw, returned repeatedly to exposed positions under enemy fire to evacuate wounded personnel. Utilizing improvised equipment, he successfully lowered 8 seriously wounded soldiers to safety via cliff-face descent. His actions demonstrated conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty beyond the call of normal military service. 8 soldiers. The number had become part of the legend, repeated in citation after citation, interview after interview. But Doss had never corrected the count or mentioned the 9th voice, because how could you explain hallucinations born of exhaustion to reporters looking for clean heroes and simple stories? A letter had arrived the previous week from a historian writing a book about Okinawa. The usual questions: how many trips up the rope? What were you thinking during the rescues? Did you ever doubt you'd survive the night? Standard queries that treated his actions like mathematical problems with clear solutions and definite answers. Doss had set the letter aside unanswered, as he did most requests for interviews these days. The story the world wanted to hear, unarmed soldier saves 8 men through faith and determination, was true but incomplete. It left out the part where his mind had started breaking down, where he'd chased phantom voices while real wounded might have died elsewhere, where even the strongest convictions had eventually reached their limits. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows, with a rhythm that reminded him of machine gun fire echoing across a coral plateau. He got up and walked downstairs, past the framed medal and commendations, to the kitchen where he made coffee and stood looking out at the storm. In the early morning light, he could see his neighbor's barn, where a frayed rope hung from the hayloft, simple farm equipment that had nothing to do with war or rescues or desperate prayers in the darkness. But every time he saw it, he remembered the feel of hemp under strain, the sound of individual strands parting, the weight of human life hanging in the balance. The telephone rang, startling him from his reverie. A voice on the other end identified itself as a documentary filmmaker from California. Another request for an interview about your heroic actions on Hacksaw Ridge. The usual questions followed. How did it feel to save 8 men? What drove you to keep going back? Did your faith give you special strength that night? I'm sorry, Doss said politely. I don't do interviews anymore. But, sir, your story inspires people. Your actions prove that one person can make a difference, that Doss hung up gently, as he'd done dozens of times over the years. The filmmakers and journalists always wanted the same story: clean heroism, triumphing over impossible odds, faith rewarded with miraculous success, 8 families reunited because one man refused to give up. They never asked about the cost of carrying such a night in your memory, or the weight of knowing that courage has limits, or the way certain sounds could transport you back to a plateau where voices called from darkness you couldn't penetrate completely. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, revealing patches of blue sky between the clouds. Doss finished his coffee and walked back upstairs, past the medals and citations that told only part of the story, to the bedroom where he kept a small, worn Bible, the same one he'd carried on Okinawa. Inside its pages, pressed between verses about bearing one another's burdens, lay a fragment of hemp rope. He'd kept it all these years as a reminder not of heroism, but of limits, both the rope's and his own. 8 men had lived because that hemp had held when it shouldn't have. One voice had gone unanswered because even the strongest determination eventually reached its breaking point. The fragment was barely 2 inches long now, worn thin by decades of handling during sleepless nights when the sound of rain brought back memories of a cliff face in the darkness. It reminded him that behind every medal there was a human being carrying weight the citations couldn't capture, and that the real measure of that night wasn't the number of men saved, but the cost of trying to save them all. As the storm moved east toward the mountains, Doss sat by his window and listened to the silence that followed the rain. Somewhere in California, a filmmaker was probably already dialing another number, looking for a different veteran with a cleaner story. Somewhere in military archives, his after-action report reduced that night to typed paragraphs and official language. But here in the quiet morning light of Georgia, an old man held a piece of frayed rope and remembered what heroism actually felt like from the inside. Not like triumph, but like responsibility. Not like certainty, but like faith tested to its breaking point. Not like the end of the story, but like the beginning of a lifetime spent carrying the weight of what you did and couldn't do on one dark night when everything hung by a thread. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.